All right, what's going on, everybody? Nick here with Late Night Chess, and we're continuing our series with Knight and Pawn Endgames. Now, this one's going to be a little bit shorter of a video. We're wrapping everything up here, but before we finished up our Knight and Pawn Endgames, I wanted to go over the rare instance where you could actually checkmate with just a knight and a king. So it doesn't happen very often in Knight and Pawn Endgames. I've never seen it happen, but it's still a good pattern to know if and when you ever do encounter that on over the board play or tournament play. So let's take a look at this position here. Hopefully you're able to know that this position is a draw. White has only a knight and a king, and black has only a king. And there's really nothing white can do to checkmate here. White can move around with his knight, but black's going to be able to always have some square that he can move to. And there's just simply no way for white to be able to checkmate. So this is a dead draw. What's interesting, though, is if you just place a pawn on the right square, this game goes from white drawing to white actually winning. So take a look at this position, and now let's look at this next one, where we simply just have an additional pawn on a3. Interestingly enough, this goes from a draw for white to a win for white. So this previous position was a draw for white, obviously, but now with this black pawn on a3, white can actually win. And white can win in two moves. So if you want to try and see what the winning combination is, feel free to pause the video and give it a try yourself, and then I'll walk you through the solution. Okay, so the idea is to force black to have to move his pawn to a2. If we can get the black king to be smothered in the corner by his own pawn, then we're going to be able to deliver a quick mate. And so the correct move is knight to c1. And knight to c1 stops the king from being able to come to a2. And so black only has one legal move here. Black has to play his pawn to a2. And then after that, the knight comes to b3 and delivers a checkmate. So this is the very simple pattern I would suggest you to memorize. When you do encounter knight versus pawn endgames, if you can try and get your black king to be cornered and smothered by his own pawn on the second or the seventh rank, then it's possible you could deliver checkmate. It's very rare. Typically, white is going for a draw by trying to take the pawn, but this can happen. I've never seen it happen, but I think it's definitely possible. And it's important to know, not just so you can, in that rare instance where you do find this position, are able to mate, but maybe, if you look a couple moves back before this, maybe you can think about how to start setting that net up to be able to mate the king. So let's take a look at one more position that's going to employ the same themes, but it's a little bit more complicated. So here we have black with two pawns and a king, and keep in mind the black pawns are going in this direction. So this black h pawn is 2 squares away from queening. And this looks like, at first glance, it looks like maybe black is going to win this, or at least draw. But there doesn't seem like there's any chance for white to be able to win this position. But if you employ the pattern that we just learned in the previous example, where the knight could, or where white could try and smother black's king into the corner, then actually you'll discover that this is a forced mate for white. So white is able to force a checkmate from black. And it's a checkmate in 4 moves. So if you want to try and pause the video on this one, see if you can recreate that pattern that you just saw where the knight checkmates the king and the king is in the corner. So feel free to pause the video. Okay, so if you were able to find the correct move, congratulations. It's a pretty tricky puzzle, but the right answer is knight to f6. So in puzzles like this, let's look at all different possible variations after knight f6. So black has 2 possible moves. Black can either push his pawn to g5, or the black king can come to h1. Right? So let's look at both of those and see if we can force a mate in both. So let's start with the king going to h1. So if the king comes to h1, then the knight has this really nice move, knight to g4. And the idea behind knight to g4 is somewhat similar to the last position I showed you, where the black king can no longer come back up. So black is forced to decide whether or not he wants to push his G pawn forward or push his H pawn forward. So let's take a look at both of those variations. If he decides to push his H pawn forward, now this pattern should look very familiar to the last position. The black king is in the corner. He's smothered by his own pawn. They're like alarm bells should definitely be going off to see if you can checkmate the king, and indeed you can. After the white king comes to f1, black would be in stalemate if it weren't for this g pawn. So black only has one legal move, and that's coming to g5, and then white can deliver the final blow on f2, checkmate. So that's definitely a mate if the king decides to go to h1 and then the pawn plays to h2. But let's see what happens if instead of the pawn playing to h2, the pawn goes to g5. So if the pawn goes to g5, oops. Yeah, so here, if the pawn decides to go and play to g5, then you still have a similar idea, right? You have king to f1, and then after king to f1, black only has one legal move. That's pawn to h2. And then you can still deliver checkmate in the same thing. So that means coming back to this position, if white plays knight to f6 and the black king comes to h1, we know we have a forced mate. So now all we have to do is take a look at what happens when black plays g5. So if black plays g5 right away, we can still deliver a mate by playing knight to g4. And there's only one legal move here. The king has to come to h1. And again, we set up the exact same mating net. King to f1, and then black only has one legal move here, pawn to h2, and then the knight can deliver mate on f2. So this is why it's good to know these mates, because even in positions like these where, at first glance, it's, if I'm white, I'm thinking, there's no way I'm winning this. I'd be lucky if I could force a draw here. But actually, white is winning here, and it's because of this checkmating theme where black is in the corner. So if you can keep that in mind and try and find these opportunities that might come up in a real game, and you should be able to checkmate your opponent now. So this is the last part in a 4-part series of knight and pawn endgames. What I'll do in the next video is synthesize everything we learned. So in the first video, we learned about knight circuits for rook pawns. In the second video, we learned about creating a barrier against rook pawns. In the third video, we talked about how knights can deal with central pawns. And then this last video, we showed how to checkmate a king with just a knight and a king, assuming that your opponent has at least one pawn to smother himself. So what we'll do in this last video that I'll post pretty shortly is synthesize all of this with a series of puzzles. Maybe 2 or 3 puzzles we'll go over and see if we were able to synthesize all of the information that we learned from these last 4 videos. So thanks everybody for tuning in, and I'll see you soon.